Hey, welcome to the Vinyl Verdict. Wanted to do something a little bit different, a book review of the Mccartney Legacy Volume 2 by Adrian Sinclair and Allan Kozinn. And I know this has gotten a lot of publicity on different podcasts, but I'm a big fan of this series as well. Got both. I got the first one that came out, I think, 2020 during the pandemic, and then the second version that just came out during the holiday season. And I waited a while to do the review of this second one and talk about it because I've been reading it since it came out. And I think it's a really informative overview for a McCartney fan and really just any kind of music fan to see what Paul McCartney was doing and how dense every day and month of his life really was. This is now the second half of the 70s. And compared to the first series, I really like to compare these two because I think it's a great way of breaking up his life into segments and digestible segments, although it's 700 and something pages, the second one. But it's easy to read. So I think, the first one is really Paul McCartney after the immediate collision of the Beatles breaking up. It's kind of the Big Bang and particles going everywhere in the universe and forming new compounds. And then Wings has, by 1974-ish, right, it's starting to take on a familiar form. You're finding some defining characteristics of each member of the Beatles. And it also briefly touches on what George and John and Ringo are up to during different sections. And you see, again, some familiarity there as the solo career of each member emerges. Whereas it could really go any direction. And Paul's kind of fighting for his identity, really, in the first part of the series. But it's still an unknown future. I mean, John Lennon is alive in this entire second book. And so it revisits this theme a little bit of what's going to happen next. And, is it possible there would be a Beatles reunion, which gets close on multiple occasions. So I'm not going to do a full actual review of the whole book, but I just wanted to cover a couple topics in here that I thought were kind of interesting and news to me as someone who's a big McCartney fan. The first thing is actually where the book starts, which is during the Mike McGear session. So Paul McCartney helping his brother to record an album, and I know these are called like the stealth Wings sessions because you already have a lot of the backing band. It's kind of interesting. I never knew the full history of just how much of a promotional effort was involved in making that happen. There's two mentions to Badfinger, which we love on this channel, and the first one occurs, Paul McCartney calls up Tony Visconti and asks him to do the final arrangements for the Band on the Run tracks, which we know were kind of uncredited and there's some controversy there. But he then calls Tony again and asks him to help with the Mike McGear album. So this is all kind of January 74, and it's mentioned this is the first time that Paul had reached out to Tony since Maybe Tomorrow. And maybe that McCartney had liked his production on Maybe Tomorrow and on the T-Rex and David Bowie albums. The other piece I thought was interesting is that the McGear album was released September 24th, 1974, and that's just a month before Badfinger's Wish You Were Here album, also on Warner Brothers. So these are two pretty significant Warner Brothers Beatle-related kind of acts that are happening at the same time. And so I wonder if McCartney was aware of that and maybe tracking those Warner Brothers Badfinger releases. Anyway, so we kind of fast forward. There's some other notable events that happen around this time. There's the Toot and a Snore kind of bootleg session where we know John and Paul jammed together. Nothing that notable happened during the session, but it's notable that it happened at all. I never knew what Paul was really up to during early 74. And so you have him doing the backing track for Let's Love. You have the 4th of July recording. And then by the second half of 74, or maybe over the summer, we start to get to some overdubbing for Wide Prairie and Hey Diddle. And then notably the first real song that Wings covers as Wings, which is Sally G and Junior's Farm. And so, kind of interesting. We get into the one-hand clapping sessions immediately after that, which have recently been released and revisited past year. And then we get to a really interesting point in the book. It's dated as December 19th, 1974. Paul and Linda go to see George Harrison close out his 1974 Dark Horse tour with the Madison Square Garden concert in New York. It's a big event. It's the first time Paul's really seeing a Beatle perform in the U.S., really on the eve of Paul, George, and Ringo had all signed the papers to dissolve the Beatles right before this. John was even promised George to appear on stage, but he locked himself in his own room over fear, as it's detailed in this book. And it's a great what could have been. I mean, can you imagine what song would he have come out and played on? I mean, would it have been In My Life, where George is singing In God's Life? I mean, he's kind of, changing John Lennon's own song. I don't know how he would have felt about that. It also mentions pressure of Julian visiting and tax implications as some of the reason. But I think with John, a lot of times it was pressure. And I think about Paul just seeing George Harrison perform at Madison Square Garden, December 19th, 1974. The last time George played at Madison Square Garden, he was playing Here Comes the Sun with Pete Ham next to him, right, during the concert for Bangladesh. And here he is, 3 or so, a little over years later, and he's not even playing that song live, which is a pretty iconic kind of George Harrison song. It says John and Paul attended a private party at the Hippopotamus Club for George Harrison. I don't think Ringo was there, but again, pretty close to a reunion. I think it was probably the only case of John, Paul, and George being together after the Beatles. This is kind of, the reunion is in high alert during 74, 75. January of 75, John is supposed to go to New Orleans to meet with Paul, maybe work on some of the Venus and Mars sessions. Doesn't happen, but again, kind of interesting timing. More about the concept of Venus and Mars than I was expecting. I always knew Band on the Run, emerged as sort of a concept album, maybe more in hindsight, but I didn't realize how much Paul wanted Venus and Mars to follow up Band on the Run and was putting all this effort into it, and these billiard balls on the cover, and writing out all the sequencing to the songs while he was in Holiday in Jamaica. And it mentioned in the book, this was really the only time that Paul wrote out the sequencing to an album and then didn't change it later on. So it was very intentional throughout. The other big crossover with Badfinger obviously being in late April 1975, where Paul goes into Apple Studios for the second time ever. And the first time was when he recorded Give Ireland Back to the Irish way back in, I think, 71. And this is just a couple months after Head First, and this is, on the eve of, Pete Ham taking his own life and the tragedy there. And here's Paul in Apple Studios where they were, and he's working with Mike McCartney on the follow-up to the McGear album. I mean, it just seems like he's very similar circumstances. And then there's a brief mention of Pete's death, maybe speculating a little bit on how that might have affected Paul. I think John Lennon was on the Tomorrow Show, mid-April of 75, and so maybe that combined with hearing about Pete led Paul not to wait too long to make amends with his friends. But what's really notable is it calls out a Rolling Stone article in July of 1975. And I actually found the article here, which is fascinating because Paul brings up Pete Ham himself. The interviewer doesn't ask about it. It's very unlike when George Harrison brought it up. It clearly affected him enough to mention this during the press conference of a #1 Wings album. And Paul McCartney is a guy who has a pretty good sense of PR, I would say, historically. So him bringing this up kind of shows maybe a lack of control and just how much it affected him. Again, I think this is kind of a fascinating final comment that Paul really leaves until the 90s when he's doing the VH1 review. So we're about 250 pages into the book, and that's when the first album comes out since the book started, which is Venus and Mars, the follow-up to Band on the Run. So you can see it's really detailed, and it does show you the arc of Wings and just what's happening behind those album releases. Rock Show is on the album, kind of manifesting the energy that it's becoming a live band, and they're going towards a stadium type tour. And so I think, Paul had this idea to just manifest what he wanted. And so he's putting these tracks and writing songs that he can perform in that environment. He's also seeing George Harrison live. He's seeing Led Zeppelin live. And, but it's really only on a holiday in France after the release of Venus and Mars that he starts plotting the tour in a more tactical way and realizing, it's going to start with smaller shows and then kind of build up to these big arenas in America. Meanwhile, the chart success is kind of hit or miss by Venus and Mars. I think obviously it's got, listen to what the man said, huge #1. Letting Go is mentioned to be the worst post-Beatles charting song for Paul, and maybe it's because it was released too late after the album, but it doesn't have necessarily the same appeal. And then he's already starting to record some tracks for the follow-up to that, Wings at the Speed of Sound, Be Where My Love, and The Note You Never Wrote. He tours Australia a little bit, would love to see some cleaned up footage of that. And a lot of interesting historiography here with Paul's contemporary interview about Cook of the House and being written about Linda taking stuff out in their kitchen that they were renting in a home in Australia. But later, and more recently, I think with the remaster, Paul says that, he wrote the song and saying now that, maybe he never wrote Let 'Em In for Ringo, even though at the time he mentioned he did. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think the staying power of Venus and Mars is kind of a weird element in this era of Wings history. He's already kind of recording another album for the US tour, and so I don't know that Venus and Mars really ever had Paul had the same ownership over it that he did for Band on the Run. The story kind of continues through the chronology that this rumor that Paul and John were together when the Saturday Night Live sketch about offering them, some small amount of money to reunite came on, and kind of mentioning that, well, Paul could have only been there to see John on April 24th, 1976. He quotes watching it on a re-air, but that conflicts with his calendar at the time. And so anyway, a lot of interesting historiography, which kind of shows which gaps support the idea of this happening. Fast forward to 1976, now Paul McCartney's playing Madison Square Garden for the first time. George was doing it, 2 years before, and Lennon had already played it, and Ringo at Bangladesh. So interesting, they mentioned he's the last Beatle to play Madison Square Garden on his own, which is crazy as the Beatle who's touring for 50 years after this. And now also the first time that he went to Tucson, Arizona is actually during this tour in June 76. So interesting that his reference in Get Back was really just based on Linda and not having been there himself. Maybe it was just like some exotic thing in his mind. I've seen this mentioned online, but I also thought it was interesting. I'm very biased, focusing on the Wings Over America album and tour there, and I never thought as much about Wings Over Europe in the 76 tour and the way that transition kind of happens, especially the transition from Wings Over America, where he's playing the huge stadiums, to London Town. And so this book does a great job of capturing that, first by playing some additional shows in Europe and Yugoslavia, and I went and listened to that concert, and it is truly amazing how he repeats Yesterday. Recording Name and Address already, the first song by February of 77. I mean, recording on a boat in the Virgin Islands, pretty much the opposite of recording in Nigeria in an unfinished studio. So with London Town, he really is taking it in a different direction. I also didn't know the exact timing of when Jimmy McCullough left, so it's August 77, meaning he already is on a lot of the tracks. It says Jimmy didn't really have anything to play out. There's a lot of acoustic songs and stuff. And the last song I think he walked out on was that he heard the first day or two of Mull of Kintyre. So that is a really interesting inflection point of what the band's becoming, and kind of the nature of Paul maybe receding from trying to write pure pop contemporary songs. Mull of Kintyre might be the song that single-handedly broke up Wings, because Joe English was also frustrated about not playing on it. Also, his girlfriend's accident and everything like that, and drugs, and maybe wanting to go home to the US. So there's other reasons, but he happens to leave around the same time. James McCartney is born the next month, and that's a big turning point for Wings. Again, they don't really audition members in the same way that they did. Paul doesn't seem too keen to instantly hire backfills or tour again. The next iteration is really Denny bringing in Lawrence Juber and Steve Hawley. So fascinating also that Name and Address, the first song recorded for London Town, was also really the last song that he did overdubs on, where Paul plays the guitar solo. I never knew why he played the guitar solo if it was the first song done, but now it makes a lot more sense, and he's kind of bookending those sessions. I also never realized that he's playing the drums on Cufflink, which is a cool little transition, and it makes sense when I listen to it now, but he didn't really have any issue kind of going back to that mode. Kind of fast forwarding, Mull of Kintyre is the first #1 single that Paul has in the UK as a solo artist with Wings. And he's already recording Goodnight Tonight by February 78 as well. So pretty quick after that finishes. The first time Steve Hawley's involved is actually separate from Lawrence Juber. I forgot. He's in the With a Little Luck video, which he's not playing on the record, but he's featured in the video. And he was not really a member of Wings at the time. So Paul denies that he's the new drummer when he's on this boat at a party. And it's kind of reinforced by the fact that Paul plays drums on Did We Meet Somewhere Before, which was a song that he kind of commissioned for a soundtrack. He's wondering maybe if he's going to do an album like Band on the Run. I wonder if there was part of him that even wondered if Denny hadn't pushed for Lawrence Juber and Steve Hawley. Was there any decision point in Paul's head about continuing the band as a three-piece or something? Anyway, so then London Town comes out in March of 78. April is when Lawrence Juber and Steve Hawley formally auditioned for the band. Good points made, I think, in the book about just that, there's a little bit of editorializing, but I think it's done very tastefully, and it mentions the contrast and the professionalism of Steve and Lawrence compared to like Jimmy and Joe English, and maybe that's what Paul was looking for. The first song that they all played together is Same Time Next Year. Very weird. And then they work on the Rupert session, so basically a full soundtrack, and that's basically all recorded on one day in July 78, which is a lot of music, and it's beautiful music. I've always loved listening to it. Amazed that was done so quickly. And I guess Lawrence Juber had said was amazed as well by just Paul's professionalism at the time and his creative range in putting together all those different types of songs. Anyway, they start working on some of the early Back to the Egg sessions and all of that. And it's mentioned, I never knew George Harrison visited during the sessions, and thankfully, maybe with a little luck, no pun intended, he visited during Baby's Request. And he really liked that song because it was, a little bit slower paced and traditional, and so he gave it a thumbs up. It's Lawrence Juber's kind of quoting it, and imagine if he visited during Spin It On or something. I think it would have been a little bit of a different reaction. And then I had heard, I think, that Daytime Nighttime Suffering was written as the attempt where Paul said in January of 79 everybody should go home and write a hit But I didn't realize how much he debated the A-side, B-side debacle between Good Night Tonight and Daytime, Nighttime Suffering. And specifically thinking about, which one was more commercial. Good Night Tonight was recorded a year earlier, but he puts more overdubs on it. And he ends up doing a different option. I think he does Good Night Tonight in the US and Daytime, Nighttime Suffering in the UK. And then I guess he's going to continue that with Coming Up, right? Where he puts a live version and a studio version out depending on the market. So Chris Thomas comes in, obviously worked on a lot of earlier Paul McCartney stuff, but also Badfinger. And so he's there in 79 working on Back to the Egg, and he's, he likes some of the tunes, but he's also, you can tell there's a lot of frustration with Paul's constant, almost OCD attention to detail on mixing and adding brass and and adding a lot of, I would say maybe some supplementary tracks to it. And the mixing process does take forever. I mean, there's questions about like Getting Closer, which he recorded, I think in October 78, and Denny Lane was singing the lead vocals on it. And then Paul just randomly, seems to add his own vocals on it almost 5 months later. So there's not a lot of detail about why he did that and kind of why arranging and mixing is taking so long. Different speculation, maybe about the pressure of being on Columbia for his first release there. I also never realized, that's kind of the theme of me reviewing this book, I never realized that after Back to the Egg was done that they recorded some additional songs so quickly. They were doing the Denny song Weep for Love, the experimental Robber's Ball, and then Cruising Ahead, which is like a fun kind of Elvis impersonation song. And that's in May 79. So that's kind of beginning the transition, I think, from Back to the Egg to McCartney 2, where Paul is getting more experimental, and maybe it wasn't a complete surprise to everyone as he was leaning into synth and these things. By 79, Paul mentions getting a letter from Kurt Waldheim, head of the UN, about a reunion show for the Beatles. And Kurt writes him that was a hoax, but would he do a show? So this kind of supports some of the narrative of my conversation with Perry Mucker-Heide. So definitely check that out. I thought it was kind of cool to see that reinforced in the book here and in Paul's own anecdotes that were sourced. And then the trip to Japan, so we all know how that went. But I never realized Chris Thomas was on the trip. And so he recorded the concert for Kampuchea and was helping Paul with his live concerts and was even going with him to Japan, I assume, to help record those shows. Yeah, very cool. I hope we don't have to wait another 3 years for the final version. I mean, the 80s really are some of the cryptic, kind of least documented periods of McCartney's solo career, and I personally love them. So I'm really excited for the third edition, the third volume, which should be coming out soon. And I would definitely recommend check out the second book. You don't need to read the first one, but you should if you haven't. I mean, these are really should be on the shelf of any Paul McCartney fan. So hope you enjoy it. And let me know what your thoughts are.